Welcome to the Unitarian Christian Alliance Podcast, Episode 25, Wandering, Arguing, and Culture, with Anne Fischhaber. I'm Mark Kane. Wait a minute, that doesn't seem right.
Yeah, that doesn't seem right. Go ahead and say your name.
Okay. And I'm his wife, Karen. He has laryngitis and doesn't want to talk too much.
Perfect.
Today we journey across the continents and explore the impact of culture. Mark.
Hey, at least my whistler is working.
Anne has had the unique opportunity to experience multiple cultures. And today, Mark! And today we can vicariously enjoy her experiences and wisdom earned through a rather colorful and unexpected voyage.
Hey, Anne, I'm delighted you're here.
Yeah, me too, Mark.
So you live in Minnesota now, but you didn't always. You've had a wide path of travel.
Depending on how much time you have, Mark. First of all, I was born on the road. Literally, my mom never made it to the hospital.
Oh.
So, like being dubbed a wanderer by birth. And who cannot be in one place now? I live in Minnesota, but I was born in Africa.
Where in Africa was this?
Nairobi, Kenya.
All right.
I spent quite a bit of my childhood in Africa. I came to know the Lord in Africa. Thank God for missionaries. There was a Bible college not too far from where we lived. So they came to teach at the Bible college or to visit churches. And so that's my earliest conscious understanding of Christianity.
Okay.
These were, I think, evangelicals, Assemblies of God, Baptists. But back then, for me, it was just, missionaries talking about God, period. Just like you go to school, what the teacher says, you do. So, of course, Trinity was heavily presented up front as part of the deal.
Yeah.
So for me, that's what I took with me.
Right. Did you attend like a regular gathering? Was there a recurring fellowship?
There was, at some point, it was regular. And then as I got older, I would go occasionally. And this was an Assemblies of God church.
Okay.
Actually, quite a big church in the city with a lot of praise and worship and a choir and all that. So that was fun.
Okay.
But it wasn't consistent, if you know what I mean.
Okay.
I would say maybe 4 or 5 years before I finally moved to Europe.
What age were you when you moved to Europe?
Let me see, how old was I?
You can approximate.
Gosh, I was probably in my early 20s.
Oh, okay.
And then I moved back to Africa and then moved back to Europe in my late 20s to early 30s.
Okay. What location in Europe were you?
I lived in Cologne in Germany. I also lived in Hanover and Saarbrücken. And then I also lived in Belgium for 2 years.
Wow.
And then back to Germany for another 3 years.
Okay.
So like I said, I was a wanderer. I traveled.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So what did you experience then when you went to Europe?
It was very confusing. I kind of almost felt like I didn't really want to be an active Christian. And the sense that I got was there's a lot of blame game going on, like the whole idea with the Holocaust and how that came to be and the role of the church and just the idea of being too involved in church activities. And these were my years of rebellion, maybe. I was just not very interested in being in a formal church setting.
I see. So the skepticism, was it because the church went along with the things that happened at the Holocaust?
At least it sounded like that. There was always the undertones that the church played a role in facilitating some of the stuff that happened. Although there were also the stories of how the church saved a lot of children and a lot of people during that time. There's always the good and the ugly. And I think people remember the ugly long after.
Yeah.
When I attended college, I remember the young people there were saying, why can't people just get over it? They're not the generation that did that. They just really wanted the Holocaust, the whole experience behind them. And they didn't feel like at that point that the church was doing a very good job to get people away from that mentality. Because you don't want to be the generation that is being tied to all the ugliness. Kind of like, I keep thinking, no wonder they stoned Stephen. He started telling these guys, you killed Christ. He did all these things and you went ahead and killed him. And the people there really didn't kill him. So I'm sure they were angry and they were annoyed. Well, I digress. But that's how I think about it, that people tend to get so angry when we generalize that you people did this. Because you feel as an individual, you've not done anything to warrant that kind of judgment, or to be labeled in that way. So there was just that. I think the younger people had a lot of problems with the labeling, and very few of them went to the church, at least I saw in the churches that I attended. Yeah, so I knew at the back of my mind, I guess, that there was something about faith, about God.
Yeah.
But I was just rebelling, I guess. I wouldn't call it active rebellion. It was very passive, which is worse. Because if you're rebelling actively, somebody might see it and come rescue you.
Yeah.
But when you're doing it passively, everybody thinks everything is kosher, and it's not.
Yeah.
You can go so far before anybody realizes, wait a minute, what's wrong with this girl? But the saving grace was, by that time, my siblings actually lived in the U.S. and they were citizens. I came over one Christmas and I was talking about coming to college. And then the following Christmas, I visited again. And my sister was living in Stockbridge. And so she told me, oh, there's a college.
Wait, that's Stockbridge, Georgia.
So, yeah, not Stockbridge, Germany, Stockbridge, Georgia. So one day we just went on a drive and she said, oh, I'll drive you. Let's just come and see this college.
Okay.
Atlanta Bible College was still in Morrow. And so we drove there and David Krog welcomed us very well. And he immediately just went to work, like the paperwork and showed me everything. And he seemed very happy that I stumbled upon the college.
What pushed you over the edge? Because here you were in Europe for a while and not that interested in faith. Something changed.
Just before I visited the second time when I came to the United States, I'd flown back to Nairobi.
Yeah.
My dad had been feeling sick then, and he was back in Kenya. And I talked to him. And I told him I wanted to go to Bible college, and he asked me why. And I said, well, I just want to know for myself, and maybe I will go into ministry. But he said, you don't have to go into full-time ministry to feel like you're serving the Lord. You can serve the Lord in your career. And I was working, I was a human resource manager, and I was doing training.
Okay.
He said, hey, you're doing a great job. You're helping a lot of people. You're supporting employers and employees. Kind of just really being very proud as a proud dad. But I said, look, I would love to know for myself. I think I'm going to go to Bible college. And I didn't think much about it. I went back to Europe. And then so when I visited with my sister, I said, I think I want to go to Bible college. At that time, it wasn't like a fire burning within me, like this big. No, it was just one of those things. In fact, it could have been just a statement. But Becky, my sister, said, okay, let's go. And that's how it happened. But I didn't join immediately. I went back to Europe because I had to clean up my stuff.
Yeah.
And take care of loose ends before I finally came to Atlanta Bible College.
Okay. Now, at that time, you didn't know that the Bible college was not Trinitarian, right?
No, and that was the farthest thing from my mind. I didn't even know what did you say, Trinitarian? I had no clue what that was.
Wait, you had no clue what the Trinity was?
No, I had no clue what it was in terms of that actually Bible colleges are also based on specific doctrinal standpoints or viewpoints. I didn't know. I thought a Bible college is a Bible college.
Okay.
So I had several assumptions about life, assumptions about Christianity, assumptions about God that completely messed me up. The first year I was like, what's wrong with you people? Again, I had no idea what I was getting into. But based on my own assumptions, I didn't really think much about the Trinity,
Okay, yeah.
Kind of like faith. You didn't discuss it or try to explain it. That's how I thought about it. So I never tried to define biblical doctrines, but what bothered me was there were so many conflicts between Catholics and non-Catholics and different denominations. And I thought, if you're all talking about God, why is it that you just don't agree? What's wrong? So my mind was already questioning. And here I am with all my assumptions and my default settings about life, about what God is all about. And remember, I had been taught by very good missionaries, bless their hearts,
Yeah.
Good missionaries who gave their lives to come to this place in Africa and tell people about God. And growing up, I was taught that if your teacher told you something, you did it. Teachers were right, pastors and priests were right.
Mm.
I mean, there were figures of authority that you listened to what they said and you ran with it.
Okay.
So to come in and have somebody start challenging the main figures of authority in my life, I thought, who died and made you God to tell me that what I believed is wrong? I was not very happy. I mean,
Okay.
I was not sad, but I
Yeah.
was going to fight and argue my position and defend my default settings and assumptions.
Mm. Okay. Well, so did you feel welcomed? I mean, you certainly had a different opinion and you were surrounded by people who had different opinions, but you stuck with it.
I did. Mark, here's the deal. It was fun. I love to argue. And the thing is, I was arguing without letting what I was hearing get into my mind. You see, it almost like I had a wall
Okay.
as far as what was coming from the other side was concerned. And I was poking a big hole to make sure that what I was saying was going through. So I was willing to give my views,
Yeah.
but not willing to listen.
Mm.
First of all, my instructors, they were amazing. But I think the person I argued with the most was probably the person who helped me the most among the instructors that I had at the Bible college.
Okay.
And then there were students in my class who were born and raised in the Abrahamic faith.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, I wish that we were taking videos or pictures of what happened after the class was over.
Yeah.
Because the most important discussions we ever had were right outside in the lobby area after class was over.
Yeah.
Because those arguments were heated and they were long.
Oh.
And I remember some of the students, it's probably not wise for me to talk about them on air when they're not aware that I'm going to talk about them. But we had
Right.
amazing...
No names.
No names. We had amazing discussions and arguments back and forth. And actually, that made me start doing my own research.
Mm.
I started thinking, no, I'm going to check this out.
Mm.
My default setting was, no, that's not true. You're wrong. You know, why do you say that?
Okay.
And they said, it's written here in scripture, say, no, you're wrong. I mean, like I said, you know, the assumptions that we make and the role of culture, very, very important. You know how there's some things that go without being said in a culture?
Yeah.
Even within a culture, within different regions, there's some things that go without being said in Minnesota that would definitely not go without being said in Georgia and vice versa.
Mm.
But within a major culture, when you talk about this, there are just some things that went without being said. For example, if you were taught about God, you didn't argue against that.
Mm.
To make matters worse, my dad, who was not a believer, eventually became a believer and became an instructor at a Bible college.
Oh.
And actually pastored and preached at many churches. And so he was also kind of reinforcing the things that I grew up learning. My mom was the believer in the family for many years before my dad. And so what I heard from the missionaries, what I heard when I attended the church, reinforced by the culture around me, the environment around me,
Mm-hmm.
the whole idea that figures of authority are people you listen to and you pay attention and you don't argue against them.
Mm.
But I always liked to argue. There were times I actually got into trouble for arguing while I was in high school. But that's a different story altogether. And I just thank God that he made me somebody who argues, because if I didn't, I probably would have left Atlanta Bible College, because I probably would have just said, hey, I don't have to sit here and listen to this.
Mm.
But I was truly intrigued. And then the same culture, the same assumptions that I had that are deeply entrenched in the culture that I grew up in,
Yeah.
are also the same things that made me start listening. And the only reason I started listening is when we started talking about the idea of Jesus Christ as the Son of God.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought, yeah, I agree. But I was still going, God the Father, God the Son. And I was told, no, God is God, the Father of our Lord Jesus Christ. And Jesus Christ is his Son. Said, yeah, that's what I just said. You know, for a long time, I'm not kidding, for a long time I kept saying, we're saying the same thing, what's wrong with you? And then I realized that, hey, something was wrong with me, not the people I was arguing against. But I think they got frustrated, they didn't get it, but they kept coming back. They probably thought they would mess up with my head, or maybe they also just enjoyed a good argument. when I decided finally, I think after a while I thought, wait a minute, maybe I should listen to some of these things. Just hear what they have to say. What does it matter? I know what I know. I believe what I believe. Let me just listen.
Might as well, yeah.
Yeah. And I kind of liked the people. I said, these are good people. Let me humor them.
Okay. How long before you decided to actually listen?
Gosh, I think I was in my second year.
Oh, wow.
Let me backtrack. The first year, one thing that actually clicked, the idea of sonship. And I think that clicked because God uses the same culture, the culture of representation and agency. I come from a large family, but for the longest time, my eldest brother was always the spokesperson for the family. And he could transact any business on behalf of my dad. And whenever he did, and if he had to attend a meeting that my dad needed to attend and could not for some reason attend, he would speak with my dad's authority completely. And he would be accorded the same respect and honor as they would accord to my dad, as though my dad was sitting right there with them. The idea of agency and Jesus Christ talking about the words that he was speaking were not his words, but the words of the Father, and talking about honoring the one who sent him, doing the work of God who gave him the mandate, the agency to preach the good news. And so that made sense because it clicked with that small piece of culture.
Okay. So that's interesting about culture. Here in the United States, yeah, you can send somebody to represent you in a case or in the court. That idea exists, but it's not like part of our culture. The way you just described it, it sounds like it was normal. Like that was the behavior that anybody in your culture would have expected. It was just part of the society you lived in there.
Yeah, the community is actually where that is very important. In fact, things are passed on, the inheritance from the father, like to the firstborn, kind of like it follows an order. And just to even backtrack, the idea of a son bringing honor to the name by which he is called, because we're called by the name of our father.
Yeah.
So when you do something that brings shame, it's not just you who is shamed, but your father who is shamed. So in other words, the agency, representation, doing things that bring honor to the family, bring honor to your father, your parents. And so it is one of the cultural pieces that perhaps we share with the Middle Eastern culture and the culture where Jesus was talking about the things that he was doing and the words that he was speaking and the fact that he was doing the work that he was sent to do, that he was given to do, and not just his own story. It was his story, but his story as told by the one who sent him, the story that is wrapped up in the message that he was given to tell.
In the verse, John 5:23, when it says that all may honor the Son just as they honor the Father, how would you explain that from a cultural perspective?
Yeah, actually that fits in very well. The honor is tied up with discipline and with respect and with doing what you've been asked to do and doing it the way that you've been asked to do it. Handling yourself in a way that the person who has given you that authority would be happy to step into that role without trying to clean up after you. It's a good thing some of us were never asked to do stuff because there would be a lot of cleaning up to do afterwards. But again, a father would not just send out a son without first of all knowing the personality of the son and the ability and also enabling them. Like sometimes when there were specific discussions, the son would be told precisely, this is my position in this. If they say this, this is what we are saying. This is how we are responding to this situation. So he would not go there and start telling his own stories. He went there and told the story that he was given. And he had to understand the whys and be able to present that. So for me, that was very important. Probably the most important thing that happened to me, to have that click. That when Jesus is preaching and teaching, he's literally telling us that this is a message that I have been given to present. It's not just mine, but I bought into it completely because I and the Father are one. We are one in purpose, and I'm doing it because I believe that this is what I need to do, and because my Father has asked me to do it. And so if you're listening to me, you're listening to my dad.
Yes.
If you respect me, you respect my dad. If you honor me as I present this to you, you're honoring my dad. Does that make sense to you?
Yes.
So the other thing that happened is when I really stopped arguing for the sake of arguing and defending my ill-informed assumptions and default settings about life,
Yeah.
when I started to listen to the other claims, to really listen, to hear what are these claims about? Why are they making these claims? Can they be defended?
Mm.
And do they make sense to me? Although that's not a very good standard, but God has worked with me on that eventually something makes sense, right?
Yeah.
And then it works well. A lot of things still don't make sense, but I believe them nonetheless because I've come to understand where they're coming from. There are a few things that I will probably die arguing about. I mean, hey, I argue for life. I will not stop. But then at least one thing that helped is that I stopped arguing for the sake of arguing. I think I started to really listen. And when I did, a lot of things came to make sense. But it was still difficult. Now, the biggest part of it is that as things started making sense to me, it became even more difficult for me to explain that to those who believed like I did before.
You're talking about your family and friends.
My friends, yeah, people who are close to me, but who don't necessarily believe like I do.
Yeah.
And that is the part of it that can get very lonely because you love your family to death.
Yeah.
But at the same time, it took God for me to get to where I am, to understand what I understand. I still don't even understand, not even a little bit. The more I study, the more I realize that I really don't know a whole lot. And so that has also taught me a little humility to just sit back and say, hey, you know what? Think about where you came from. God was merciful enough to knock some sense into your head so that even though now you can still argue, but at least you know that you have to defend your claims.
Right. Do you miss arguing all the time?
Sometimes. But I still get to argue because here's the deal. I teach critical thinking. And now I can argue a different way. My students make all kinds of claims. And then I ask them, okay, now go back and find all the evidence that you can and come back and tell me what you really think, not what your dad thinks or what your mom thinks. Not that there's nothing wrong with it, but what do you think?
Yeah.
Because for me, and here's the deal, Mark, I knew about God. But with my own assumptions and with my own default settings about life, with my arguments and my own set ways, it took God literally opening my eyes to that and causing me to stop and listen. You know what? I have even been arguing from a point of a lot of ignorance, which is so sad. I mean, I still argue from a point of ignorance occasionally, but I try not to. But it took a lot for me to realize that I'm arguing so hard, but I don't really even think I know what it means to really fully give my life over to a life that honors God, a life that honors Jesus Christ and what he stood for, and a life that honors this family of faith that we have. And for me, it clicks that way because the idea of honor makes a lot of sense to me. Christ honored God. And when he prays in John 17, when he's talking about the things that he's done, and he says, I have glorified your name. In other words, I've honored you by doing exactly what you asked me to do. And then he goes on to pray for all of us. He prays for the disciples. But then he says, not only for these people, Father, but for those who would believe as they listen to the teaching and the preaching that I've left to these people who are going to start this revolutionary thing here, to preach the gospel.
Yeah.
And that includes me. So what I'm doing as a ministry honors God, even though I didn't set out to do this. I'm in Eden Valley and I'm still thinking, wait a minute, 7 years, it's a year of Jubilee. Maybe I should start thinking, hey, what are you doing in Eden Valley? Because this was not my gig, right?
Yeah. It might be worth explaining how you got there and what is going on right now in your life.
Yeah, so like I said, I went to a Bible college to understand for myself and did my time arguing. So after I graduated, I enrolled for a master's degree in business administration.
Okay.
Got married in 2007. Tom and I moved to Rochester, New York in 2008. And Tom went to the seminary. And while he went to the seminary, I completed my MBA program, got a job in Rochester, really good job. Life was just not bad,
Okay.
We went to different cities in upstate New York, like Syracuse, and joined Bible studies or different groups there. But Tom was looking for a church where he could pastor,
Okay.
And I told him, hey, you're done. You've graduated. You've always wanted to be a pastor. Let's look. So finally, he said, let's go and visit Minnesota. Eden Valley was one of the churches looking for a pastor. And so Tom and I discussed and said, well, you have a good job and all that. Are you sure you want to move? I said, hey, if this is what God called you to do, I have my MBA. I think God will provide a job.
Okay.
So we packed up our dog and our cats and we landed in Eden Valley, Minnesota. And it was great because Tom was doing his thing. He was very happy. In fact, he said this was the happiest he was when he came to Minnesota and started programs. And I was just in the background. Actually, I didn't do anything at all within the church, not even children's ministry, nothing. I made coffee because I drink a lot of coffee. So I always, set it out so that after service, everybody would come out and have something. And that was just perfect for me, So I never paid attention to what Tom was doing. I'd listen to his messages and occasionally I would make a comment, but I didn't comment too much. People who argue a lot really like to critique other people, even if they shouldn't. And I learned that I probably shouldn't really critique too much. So I didn't pay attention to the process, procedures, anything. I mean, I was a believer. What more did anybody want from me? I love God and I'm cool. Long story short, as life always happens, Tom was so happy doing what he did. And when he was diagnosed with cancer, and because it was at stage 4, 2 months afterwards, after he passed away, the church was really devastated because we had only been in Eden Valley for a little over 2 years. And he had just started to bring the church back together. There were young people now beginning to come back to church, and everybody was very excited. And he was doing a lot of things in the community. Most of the times, I didn't even go with him. I didn't even know what he did. And then he would tell me, I was at this place. I was at this. Oh, good for you. Seriously. I think I only attended one Memorial Day service where he was doing the invocation.
Yeah.
So actually, I had no clue because I never attended the board meetings.
You were teaching, right?
At that time, I was working at the college.
Okay.
I was so far removed, and my world was just a very messy, different world from the church one.
Okay.
And so I was happy to always come back to this small town and sit down on a Sunday morning and just say, thank God I can sit here and relax and just listen to my husband preach and talk about God and tell really bad jokes. And we laughed and all that. But he loved God and did a lot of great things. So when the church asked me, well, you are at the same Bible college with Tom, right? I said, yeah. Would you like to, be our pastor for a while we look? Can you step in? And I said, I could. Okay. I wasn't thinking. I mean, I really wasn't thinking.
You didn't see that coming, I'm guessing.
No.
You were not expecting that.
No, that was not, it was not even on the radar. I was so happy that finally Tom could be a pastor and we could live here and I could do my thing. But I was not, like I said, I never attended any of those meetings.
Yeah.
I didn't even know how he put together a service, what needed to be done. Administratively, I had no clue what was going on. Really.
But then they asked you, so what did you do?
Yeah. Let me just say they're just amazing people. It's the most wonderful congregation that I've ever had to work amongst. And I'll always cherish that because everybody was just very helpful. The elders kind of did what they needed to do. And I just learned by doing. So they're expecting a sermon on Sunday morning. So I had to think, okay, so it's not just a sermon. So it's a service. So what do we need? So we have music, we have this, we have that. Okay, how much time do I need for preaching? And then I'm thinking, Dr. Joe, what did you say in that preaching class? What are we supposed to do?
You said yes then. I mean, obviously.
I said yes. Like I said, I wasn't thinking. I said yes. 7 years, year of Jubilee. I'm so happy about this 7th year. But, that's why I say God works in very mysterious ways. There's a couple that we got to know here in Eden Valley who became very good friends of ours. And after Tom died, they came to visit me and they said, you know what? We keep thinking that this idea of coming to Eden Valley wasn't really for Tom, it was for you. And I looked at them like, yeah, right. Said, no, listen. Tom was meant to kind of bring you here so you could do the ministry because he did it such a short time. And you're the one who's been here the longest to actually build that foundation and do all these things and start all those children's programs and start the Bible studies and the Wednesday prayer meetings. And I was looking at them like, I don't like you right now. I could use stronger words, but, and they laughed and said, okay, whatever. And then a year later, they came back and they're like, we told you this was where God was taking you. And I keep saying, I don't think so. But Mark, here I am. And I don't think God makes those kinds of mistakes. At least if it had been maybe within the year, I would have been out of here. I've done all kinds of things that would have made them just send me packing. And they haven't. And they don't take the hint. So, but here's the deal. In the process, if in any way I have honored God in any way, brought glory to his name, helped somebody, and a few people have said I've helped them, then I really thank God. And I tend to believe that even though this was not my gig, God will still use somebody else's gig to slide you in, right?
Yeah. Yes.
Like I've been grafted in through Tom's gig.
Yeah.
And so here I am. And I have learned a whole lot more and made a lot of mistakes, had a lot of challenges, but also I think I've seen a lot of the goodness of God. Even though I sometimes joke about it, I always go back to that. Is my life honoring God? Did my life honor God today? Did I bring glory and honor to the name of the Lord, or did I shame him? And how do I bring honor? The only way I know how to bring honor is to serve in the way that I know and to argue. I don't get a lot of good arguments. So maybe we should start something within the church where we just say, not apologetics, just come, let's argue. Let's argue together about these things. I think that's what is meant by Isaiah's come, let us reason together. Reasoning together is arguing, right?
Actually, I don't think so. I think you're completely wrong.
Oh, well, you're entitled to your opinion, and I respect that. And I could very well be wrong, but guess what? I will argue about that too.
Yeah.
I believe there are people out there probably just like me. They've grown up certain ways and they have certain assumptions about Christianity, about life, about God. For example, I grew up with the assumption that God's plan is to take me to heaven when I die. I defended that for the longest time until I realized, wait a minute, what did Jesus say about this? And why would he be coming back and setting up a kingdom here on earth? That argument just broke down so badly for me. Me who likes to argue, it just completely crumbled. And I was left holding nothing, and it terrified me. Here I am defending all these things that I think are right, and finding out that I'm actually not quite right about this. So what else am I wrong about? And I think it brought a level of humility into my life. I wish I was a very good Bible scholar, but I'm not. And that's just the truth. But one thing I know, the Apostle Paul says, if at one point you disagree on some of these things, even that God will make clear to you. In other words, he's telling the believers, don't sweat it. Don't die over those things. Don't argue to death over those things, but start by what you know. But there's certain things that I obviously still don't completely buy in, but most of them are actually based on human traditions of men, not necessarily scripture.
Right. Yeah, there's a lot of that.
And so I said, hey, I'm not even going to argue about that. That's tradition. I have a lot of traditions that I could hang on to and say that these are biblical. And if people are not reading the scripture, they might actually believe me and start following and like, yay, she's the real deal. So we have to be very careful about tradition. It can really mess up a good thing if we don't watch out what is tradition and what is scripture.
Yeah.
And how do we help people, not by arguing tradition, but bringing scripture to light, so that those who don't know and like to argue can still go back and read their Bible and say, hey, oh, okay, this is what they were saying. Maybe they have a point, but I'm not going to let them know for a whole year.
You can't give in too quick. It's got to be a real fight.
At least a year, yeah.
Well, that is a common thread, as you know, listening to the podcast. People who have come from one perspective to another, it's a period of time. Like Chuck in a previous episode, he described it just as like a year. And then we have Hildy who took a year there's just always this process where, anyway.
Well, it took Moses only 40 years to get it. So,
Yeah, only 40.
I mean, we are not very patient.
No, I suppose.
Yeah, so I've had an interesting journey. Here I am. And like I said, I seriously believe in the year of Jubilee. So I'm really looking forward to this 7th year. I don't even know why I say that. I don't know what that means. It just feels good to say that.
Yeah. Do you have like some crazy big plans? Are you going to take the whole year off and cruise the world? You know, what in the world are you going to do?
No, actually, I want to take some time to reflect and to do some study. And I'm very interested in looking into what role does culture play in our understanding of what it means to be a follower of Christ. How does culture help or mess us up in all this? Again, if you think about the culture of honor and shame, there's one that I really like to talk about. I like this because I like languages. So I wish I could just spend the rest of my life learning different languages. And different languages, different cultures have different words and terminologies that cannot sometimes directly translate into another culture. And sometimes they do, but they take on a different meaning from the original. One of the expressions, going the extra mile.
Yeah.
It has the connotation in our culture today is that you go above and beyond what's asked for you, do a little extra to be even better. But when this is put into the context within which it was expressed, it was actually supposed to bring shame because there was a law and it was acceptable that they would carry that up to a certain point, and they were not to ask the people to go beyond the 1 mile. And now that's not the only one. There are many, many like parables and teachings of Christ that if you take it out of context, and unfortunately some of them have taken on different meanings in the English language because of usage over time.
Do you think your interest in culture came from having been exposed to, well, let's see, 4? You got Africa, you've got Europe and Germany and a couple places in Europe. And then even in the United States, you were in southern United States and then in Minnesota, which
New York.
And New York, yeah. So you've had a lot of cultural experience. Does that drive your interest in this?
When I studied a little Hebrew, the little that I got at the college, I was very fascinated by the language because I found some words that are exactly the same words in my mom's language. My ancestors migrated from along the Nile all the way, going down to the Eastern Africa. So I'm wondering whether like migration-wise, there were languages that just kept adapting from that. But what made me interested in this is just an understanding of different cultures and realizing the role that culture can play in our understanding of our world or even how we react to certain things. I realize that I think about things very differently and I have different lenses through which I look at things and I have different worldviews. And depending on what I'm looking at, my brain can decide to apply a different worldview if it's convenient. Like, this is convenient. I'm totally going with this worldview and this culture. And I'm here, oh yeah, forget that culture. I'm going with this. I do that because I can and because I kind of sound like I have it all together, which is very confusing. But I just love cultures. Yeah. And again, the reason I do that is because the same Christ who preached within the Middle Eastern culture in that area of Palestine, he was actually talking to one culture but very different subcultures, the Samaritans and the Judeans.
Yeah.
Even just the story of the Good Samaritan and the story of the Samaritan woman.
Yeah.
When you go into the details of those stories and look at the cultural nuances of that, you kind of get a totally different context than if you're just looking at it like, oh yeah, this Good Samaritan was good, but those guys were just mean and they didn't do. There's a whole background to that. And the woman at the well, why this well? And why at that time? And why Christ? And we can't just assume, oh yeah, she was pretty messed up. Not necessarily. It totally misunderstand the culture of that and the intended lesson for that. It wasn't even about who was right and who was wrong. So Samaritans, they our forefathers gave us this, but you say, Jerusalem is where we should worship. Essentially, Jesus is saying yes, but listen, none of that is important. The reason I'm here is because this is the way. He's the way things are going to happen. From now on, people are going to worship in spirit and truth. It will no longer be that people worshiping in Jerusalem from the temple are the ones who are actually truly worshiping. Or those of you who are worshiping here, who are looking at the wells that your ancestors put together and the places that are sacred to you, yeah, you're both right because you're following what you know and the culture that you grew up in and all that. But here's the deal. As believers, we have a third culture. There's the culture that I grew up in, the assumptions that I make about life, and then there's the culture of the other person. It could be any other culture that is not yours.
Yeah.
But Jesus is saying, hey, here's a third one. So Jesus offers a third alternative that is for all of us. And that's why he makes a very strong declaration that to all who received him, all who believed in his name, he gave them power to become children of God. Go back to the Samaritan. It's like, okay, so this is your culture. This is what you've always done. There's nothing wrong with that. This is how you're told to worship. Then Jerusalem, this is a temple. We've always done this. Jesus was mad that people had made the temple into a messy place that didn't look like a temple anymore. And so it's not like he didn't have zeal for the house of the Lord or zeal for that temple. But he's not saying that the Judeans are right. It's Jerusalem. You Samaritans, you got it wrong. He just said, no, the time is coming. In fact, the time has now come where those who worship must worship in spirit and truth. It will no longer be only those who are able to go to Jerusalem, where there were all kinds of gatekeepers so that the poor people could not even get into the temple. It was very exclusive because traditions were put around it to make it difficult for people to worship.
Yeah.
Or the Samaritans who had their noses in the air for the Judeans and felt like because this was the well and this is the place, they've got it all together. Those guys don't know what they're doing. Jesus is saying, no, stop that. I know this is how you are, but stop it. And that's why he says he came to his own, but his own did not receive him. Why? Because he was not really of that culture. Even though he was of that culture, what he brought was the God culture that says you worship in spirit and truth. So my interest in cultures is tied up with that. I just want to understand those nuances.
Well, it sounds like your adventure is destined to continue.
I think so. I'm a wanderer, by nature.
Yeah. Well, I found myself listening to you talk, and my mind was going in different directions about the cultures and the different experiences. And I guess it means a lot because you've witnessed multiple cultures. And, many of us, we grew up and we still live in the same place that we always lived. And we don't even have that switch that you described to flip it and think, well, I'm going to think about it from this perspective or from that perspective. When you described the agency that takes place normally in your childhood home, I'm like, I don't even have that as a perspective in my mind. I appreciate that you could open up about some of those experiences so that maybe some of us who live in our little small bubbles can see through your eyes some of those interesting experiences and can appreciate that, there really are dramatically different cultural experiences that people have around the world.
I appreciate the time you've taken to talk to me.
Yeah.
And as I said, I'm still wandering around. If you hear somebody who wants to have an argument, just let me know. Or if they're still in the stage where they're arguing, I'd love to listen to their argument. I promise I won't be obnoxious. And I won't laugh because I've been there.
Yeah.
Yeah, argument got me to where I am today. I argued my way right into the very place that I was arguing against. And good luck, Mark, with the rest of your podcasts.
Thank you.
I'm looking forward to seeing the puppet show.
Shh, that's still a secret.
Well, you can always edit it out. Yeah, and I'm not going to tell them anything anymore. They have to listen to this. I mean, you're a very funny guy and you have a lot of interesting things. But seriously, if they're out there and they're wondering, life is so simple and easy and good and beautiful if we live in honor of God and honor one another.
Yeah.
I think we can do very well then.
I think so.
Yeah.
Thank you, Ann.
You're welcome.
Thanks, Ann and Mark. To clarify something, Ann mentioned Abrahamic Faith. Early in the history of the Church of God General Conference, they were called the Church of God of the Abrahamic Faith. Many of those churches still use that name. It's based on the group's hope in the promises made to Abraham that one day he would possess and dwell in the land, as would we. It was his faith in that promise that found favor with God.
Well said.
Well, you wrote it. Here's a message about episode 19.
Hi, this is Cheryl from Georgia. Just want you to know the God is not dead drama is hilarious.
Thanks, Cheryl. I wonder if I sound a bit like Thomas in that skit. It was fun. Hope to get some more mileage from it.
That was episode 19, Credibility and God's Death. Hey, you didn't ask me to be one of the disciples. Anyway, here's some thoughts from across the pond in the UK regarding episode 23.
Sorry.
On episode 23, the wheels fell off.
Hi, Mark. It's Andrew White here. That was a great podcast with Chuck, because like Chuck, I haven't got any sort of Greek or Hebrew, or I haven't gone to theological college. I happen to think that that's an advantage. I think God's word works best when we are a blank sheet of paper. I think the word of God then can affect your conscience and your heart more powerfully. I think a lot of people are in a very difficult position because they have inherited ideas and concepts which are so foreign to the Bible, and yet they can't see the wood for the trees. Very sad situation to be in. When Jesus died, the fact that he was the King of the Jews was in Greek, Hebrew, and Latin. God's not interested in the language that we use. It's the message that is communicated. Now, clearly, it's helpful to have access to lexicons and so on and so forth, but we ought to avoid making people feel inadequate because they don't either have the theological training that somebody has had, or because they haven't learnt Hebrew or Greek. I think this is a big mistake, and we are placing academia before biblical truth.
Thanks, Andrew. If you have feedback, click the record link in the show notes or on the podcast page, podcast.unitarianchristianalliance.org. Claire wrote a short note. Thank you and thank you and thank you again. God bless and keep you going.
Love it. Thank you.
You can write too. Email podcast@unitarianchristianalliance.org. Anne, I loved your story. Thanks for taking the time to interview with Mark. Back when his voice was working.
Yep.
Are you sure you want me to do the ending? It's kind of your thing.
Yeah, go ahead.
All right. May God bless you in your truth pursuits. We hope this podcast serves you well.
Nice touch there.
Thanks.
That was good.